Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Picture this. You're walking through a medieval village at midnight. The only light comes from flickering candles behind shuttered windows, casting dancing shadows across cobblestone streets. Suddenly, a sleek black form darts across your path, its yellow eyes glowing like twin flames in the darkness. Your heart pounds. Your breath catches. Because in the year 1350, that innocent house cat might as well be a demon sent straight from hell. Tonight, we're diving into one of history's most bizarre and tragic chapters. The systematic persecution of black cats that swept across medieval Europe like wildfire, destroying millions of innocent lives and quite literally changing the course of human history. We're talking about an obsession so intense, so deeply rooted in fear and superstition, that it would span centuries and cross oceans. And the consequences? They were far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. But here's what's really going to blow your mind. This wasn't just some random medieval quirk. This was a calculated campaign that started with a single document spread through the most powerful institution in Europe and created a legacy of fear that still haunts black cats today. We're going to trace this story from its shocking origins all the way to modern animal shelters, where the ghosts of medieval superstition continue to seal the fate of thousands of cats every single year. And trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll never look at a black cat the same way again. Because what happened to these creatures wasn't just cruel. It was so monumentally stupid that it helped trigger one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. So settle in, because we're about to uncover a story that's equal parts heartbreaking and infuriating. A tale of how fear, ignorance, and religious fanaticism turned humanity's most helpful companions into scapegoats for everything wrong with the world. This is the dark history of why black cats were feared, hunted, and slaughtered for over 600 years. Let's start at the very beginning, because understanding how we got here requires a trip back to ancient Egypt, where black cats weren't demons, they were gods. In the land of pharaohs and pyramids, no animal commanded more respect than the cat. And black cats, they held the highest honor of all. These sleek, midnight-colored hunters were considered sacred embodiments of Bastet, the powerful goddess of protection, fertility, and the home. Having a black cat in your household wasn't just good luck. It was divine blessing made manifest. Egyptian families cherished their black cats so deeply that killing one was a crime punishable by death. When a beloved cat died, families would shave off their eyebrows in mourning and mummify their feline companion with the same care reserved for royalty. These weren't just pets. They were family members, protectors, and bridges to the divine realm. For over 3,000 years, this reverence for cats spread throughout the ancient world. Greeks admired their hunting prowess. Romans valued their independence. Even early Christian communities saw cats as useful creatures blessed with the ability to protect grain stores from destructive rodents. But everything changed on June 13th, 1233. That was the day Pope Gregory IX signed a document that would transform the cat from sacred protector to agent of Satan. The document was called Vox in Rama, and it would become the death warrant for millions of innocent cats across medieval Europe. Now, Pope Gregory wasn't specifically targeting cats when he wrote this papal bull. He was actually trying to combat a heretical cult in Germany that he claimed worshipped the devil through bizarre rituals. But buried in the document was a description that would haunt cats for centuries to come. According to the Pope's account, these devil worshippers would encounter a mysterious black cat that would emerge from the shadows during their ceremonies. Participants were allegedly required to kiss this feline figure, which was described as a manifestation of Satan himself. The cat was portrayed as a creature that bridged the gap between the earthly realm and the underworld, serving as a conduit for demonic power. This wasn't just religious doctrine. This was propaganda with devastating consequences. The Vox in Rama established, for the first time in official church teaching, a direct connection between cats and devil worship. It painted these animals not as neutral creatures, but as active participants in evil. And since the Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, this papal declaration carried the weight of divine law. But here's the twisted irony. The very qualities that made cats effective hunters, their nocturnal nature, their independence, their ability to move silently through shadows, were now being reinterpreted as evidence of their supernatural evil. Cats didn't hunt at night because they were predators. They hunted at night because they were demons. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For decades after the Vox in Rama, cats continued to live relatively normal lives in most European communities. But the seed had been planted. The theological foundation for persecution was now in place. All it needed was the right social conditions to explode into widespread hysteria. Those conditions arrived in the form of the medieval church's growing obsession with witchcraft. As Christianity consolidated its power across Europe, church leaders became increasingly paranoid about competing belief systems. Pagan traditions, folk healing practices, and anything that smacked of pre-Christian spirituality was viewed as a direct threat to church authority. Women who practiced traditional herbal medicine were particularly suspect. These healers, often elderly and living alone, maintained knowledge of plants, potions, and natural remedies that had been passed down for generations. They lived on the margins of society, often keeping cats as companions to control rodent populations around their herb gardens. The connection was inevitable. If cats were agents of Satan, and if certain women consorted with cats, then clearly these women must be witches. The logic was circular, paranoid, and absolutely lethal. By the late 13th century, the concept of the familiar had taken root in European folklore. A familiar was supposedly a supernatural entity that served a witch, often taking the form of an animal. And what animal was most commonly identified as a familiar? The black cat. The reasoning was seductive in its simplicity. Witches needed supernatural assistance to perform their evil magic. Cats were already established as demonic creatures thanks to the papal bull. Black cats, being the darkest and most mysterious, were obviously the most powerful supernatural servants. Therefore, any woman who owned a black cat was probably a witch. This wasn't just theological theory. It was becoming legal reality. Courts across Europe began accepting the presence of cats, particularly black cats, as evidence of witchcraft. Owning a cat could get you arrested. Feeding a cat could get you tortured. Being seen talking to a cat could get you burned at the stake. The persecution reached its first horrific peak in the town of Chelmsford, England, in 1566. This was the site of one of the most infamous witch trials in British history, and at its centre was a black cat named Sathan. Elizabeth Francis, an elderly woman, was accused of receiving this cat from her grandmother, along with instructions on how to use it for evil purposes. According to the trial records, Sathan wasn't just a pet. He was a shape-shifting demon who could appear as a cat, a toad, or even a dog, depending on what wicked task needed to be accomplished. The prosecution claimed that Elizabeth had used Sathan to kill a man who had impregnated her, but refused to marry her. She supposedly fed the demon cat her own blood in exchange for its services, and in return, Sathan would carry out murders, destroy crops, and bring misfortune to anyone who crossed Elizabeth's path. When Elizabeth grew tired of caring for her demonic familiar, she allegedly passed Sathan to her neighbour, Agnes Waterhouse. Agnes supposedly used the cat to kill her own husband, destroy livestock, and terrorise the local community. The accusations grew more outlandish with each telling, but the court accepted every word as fact. Agnes Waterhouse was executed on July 29, 1566, becoming one of the first women in England to be put to death specifically for witchcraft involving a cat. But Sathan's reign of terror wasn't over. The same demonic cat was blamed for attacks and misfortunes for years afterward, creating a precedent that would be repeated in witch trials across Europe. What made these trials so effective wasn't just the testimony of accusers, it was the physical evidence that prosecutors claimed to find. Women accused of witchcraft were subjected to humiliating examinations, where officials searched for what they called the devil's mark. These were supposedly extra nipples or unusual skin blemishes that witches used to feed their familiar spirits. Any mole, wart, or birthmark could be interpreted as proof of supernatural activity. And if no obvious mark was found, prosecutors would claim that the familiar fed by sucking blood from the witch's fingers, leaving marks so small they were nearly invisible. The paranoia was becoming systematic, methodical, and absolutely merciless. Across Europe, the mere sight of a black cat was enough to trigger accusations, investigations, and executions. Communities that had lived peacefully with cats for generations were now gripped by terror at the thought of these supposed demonic creatures lurking in their midst. But the persecution of black cats was just beginning. What started as religious paranoia was about to evolve into something far more devastating. Mass killings, public burnings, and ritualized cruelty that would span centuries and continents. And the consequences of this madness would reach far beyond the fate of cats themselves. Because when you systematically eliminate the creatures that control your rodent population, you create the perfect conditions for disease, famine, and death on an unimaginable scale. Imaginable scale. The cat massacres began in earnest during the 14th century, and they were nothing short of systematic genocide. Picture entire villages mobilizing like armies, but instead of marching against human enemies, they were hunting down every black cat they could find. Men, women, and children would scour barns, alleyways, and homes, dragging terrified animals from their hiding places with the fervor of crusaders. In the Belgian city of Ypres, they turned cat killing into a festival. Every year, hundreds of live cats would be gathered and hurled from the town's belfry tower, while crowds cheered below. The tradition was so entrenched that it continued for over 400 years, from 1410 until 1817. The logic was twisted, but consistent. In prosperous years, fewer cats were thrown because clearly the devil hadn't been as active. In bad years, when crops failed or disease struck, more cats had to die to appease divine wrath. But Ypres was just one city. Across the continent, communities were inventing their own methods of feline destruction. In France, they built massive bonfires where hundreds of cats would be burned alive in wicker baskets. The smoke was believed to purify the air of demonic influence. The screams were considered proof that evil spirits were being expelled from the world. England wasn't immune to the madness. Queen Elizabeth I herself ordered cats to be burned as part of her coronation celebration in 1558. The message was clear. If the monarch of England could publicly execute cats as part of a royal ceremony, then obviously these creatures posed a genuine threat to Christian civilization. The killing methods became increasingly elaborate and cruel. Cats were sewn into sacks and beaten to death with clubs. They were tied to stakes and used as living torches. Some communities would bury cats up to their necks and use their heads as targets for stone-throwing competitions. The creativity applied to cat torture revealed something deeply disturbing about medieval European psychology. What made this persecution so effective wasn't just religious authority. It was the way the fear became embedded in every aspect of daily life. Parents would tell their children stories about black cats stealing babies from their cribs. Merchants would refuse to do business with anyone who owned a black cat. Farmers would kill any cat found near their livestock, convinced that the animal was there to curse their animals with disease. The paranoia reached such heights that even being kind to a cat could mark you as a witch sympathizer. People would cross themselves when they saw a black cat in the street. They would throw stones at cats sleeping in doorways. Children were taught to kill any cat they encountered as a religious duty. professional cat hunters emerged, traveling from village to village with specialized tools for capturing and killing felines. These weren't random vigilantes. They were organized, methodical, and often sanctioned by local authorities. Some regions offered bounties for dead cats, turning extermination into a profitable enterprise. The witch trials only accelerated the slaughter. Every woman accused of witchcraft was assumed to have a feline familiar, which meant every cat in the vicinity became evidence of supernatural activity. Trial records from across Europe show the same pattern repeating endlessly. First, a woman would be accused of witchcraft. Then, investigators would search her property for cats. Any cat found would be killed, often tortured first to make it reveal the names of other witches. But here's where the story takes a turn that's almost too ironic to believe. While Europeans were busy exterminating their most effective pest controllers, they were also creating the perfect conditions for ecological disaster. Rats and mice, suddenly free from their primary predators, began reproducing at unprecedented rates. Grain stores that had been protected by cats for generations were now defenseless against rodent invasions. Warehouses became breeding grounds for ever larger populations of rats. These weren't just agricultural pests anymore. They were disease vectors carrying something far worse than anyone could imagine. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, just over a century after Pope Gregory IX had declared war on cats. The timing wasn't coincidental. The massive reduction in cat populations had created ideal conditions for the plague-carrying rats that would kill between 30 and 60% of Europe's human population. The bacteria Yersinia pestis spread through flea bites, and those fleas lived primarily on rats. In a Europe where cats had kept rodent populations in check for millennia, the sudden absence of these predators allowed rat colonies to explode in size and spread into areas they had never dominated before. Medieval physicians had no understanding of disease transmission through vectors. They blamed the plague on everything from bad air to divine punishment for human sin. Some even blamed the cats themselves, claiming that the few remaining felines were spreading the disease through supernatural means. This led to even more intensive cat killing, which only made the plague worse. The irony was devastating and absolute. The very creatures that Europeans had massacred to protect themselves from evil were exactly the animals that could have saved them from the most destructive pandemic in human history. Cities with higher cat populations experienced lower plague mortality rates, but this correlation was invisible to medieval minds, convinced that cats were the problem, not the solution. As the plague raged across the continent, some communities finally began to recognize the connection between cats and pest control. Desperate authorities in plague-stricken cities started importing cats from regions that had been less zealous about feline extermination. These cats were expensive, rare, and treated like precious commodities rather than demonic threats. But the damage was already done. The cat population of Europe had been so thoroughly decimated that it would take centuries to recover. And even as some practical minds began to appreciate the value of cats for rodent control, the religious and superstitious associations remained deeply embedded in European culture. The witch trials continued well into the 17th century, and cats remained central to the accusations. The famous Salem witch trials of 1692 and 1693 showed how these European superstitions had travelled across the Atlantic with Puritan colonists. In Salem, owning a cat was still considered suspicious, and several of the accused witches were said to have used feline familiars in their supernatural activities. Tituba, one of the first women accused in Salem, described elaborate visions of supernatural animals, including red cats and black dogs, serving the devil. Samuel Wardwell, who was eventually executed, confessed to encountering a group of cats behind a house 20 years before the trials. one of which had spoken to him and claimed to be a prince of the air. The testimonies from Salem reveal how thoroughly cat phobia had been woven into colonial American consciousness. These weren't just European superstitions being imported wholesale. They were beliefs that had been refined, intensified, and adapted to New World anxieties about wilderness, isolation, and spiritual contamination. What's particularly striking about the Salem trials is how they demonstrated the persistence of these beliefs, even in communities that should have known better. New England colonists lived in constant contact with wild animals and understood the practical value of cats for protecting food stores from rodents. Yet the supernatural associations were so powerful that practical considerations were completely overwhelmed by religious terror. The executions at Salem included 14 women, 5 men, and even 2 dogs that were killed as suspected familiars. The fact that animals could be formally executed alongside humans shows how completely the line between natural and supernatural had been erased in the colonial mind. But Salem also marked something of a turning point. The trials were so extreme, so obviously driven by hysteria rather than evidence, that they triggered a backlash against witch hunting that would gradually spread back across the Atlantic. Educated Europeans began to question whether the centuries-long persecution of cats had been based on anything more substantial than collective delusion. The Age of Enlightenment brought new ways of thinking about nature, animals, and superstition. Scientists began studying animal behavior through observation rather than theological interpretation. They discovered that cats hunted not because they were demonic, but because they were predators shaped by millions of years of evolution to control rodent populations. Slowly, painfully, European attitudes toward cats began to shift, but the damage had been so thorough, the fear so deeply rooted, that even rational arguments couldn't immediately overcome centuries of conditioning. Many communities continued to view black cats with suspicion well into the 18th and 19th centuries. The Industrial Revolution finally began to rehabilitate cats in the popular imagination. As cities grew larger and dirtier, the practical value of cats for pest control became impossible to ignore. Factory owners, warehouse managers, and ship captains began actively seeking out cats to protect their investments from rodent damage. But even as cats regained their practical value, the superstitious associations never completely disappeared. They simply adapted to new contexts and new fears. The black cat crossing your path, the Halloween imagery, the lingering unease that many people feel around felines, all of these trace directly back to those medieval documents that first declared war on an entire species. And this brings us to perhaps the most troubling part of this entire story. Because while most people today don't consciously believe that black cats are demonic familiars, the legacy of medieval persecution continues to shape the fate of these animals in ways that would shock anyone who understood the scope of the problem. The modern animal shelter system reveals one of the most heartbreaking continuations of medieval cat persecution that most people have never heard of. Walk into any shelter across America today, and you'll witness something that would be familiar to those 14th century cat hunters. Black cats are still being systematically eliminated, not through religious hysteria this time, but through something called black cat syndrome. The statistics are absolutely devastating. According to the National Library of Medicine, black cats have the highest euthanasia rate of any cats in shelters at 74.6%. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 3 out of every 4 black cats that enter a shelter will never leave alive. Their adoption rate sits at just 10%, making them the least wanted cats in America. Even as kittens, when most animals are irresistibly adoptable, black cats are the last chosen and most likely to spend their entire lives in cages. The medieval fear that once led to mass burnings and ritualistic killings has evolved into a quiet, systematic elimination that happens behind closed doors, justified not by religious doctrine, but by simple preference and lingering superstition. The reasons people give for avoiding black cats today sound eerily familiar to anyone who's studied medieval persecution. They're seen as less friendly, less playful, and somehow more mysterious than lighter-coloured cats. Potential adopters report feeling that black cats are harder to read, more aloof, and less likely to bond with humans. These aren't observations based on actual animal behaviour. They're projections of centuries-old fears onto innocent creatures whose only crime is the colour of their fur. But the problem goes deeper than conscious prejudice. There are practical barriers that disproportionately affect black cats in ways that seem almost designed to ensure their continued marginalisation. In shelter environments with poor lighting, black cats literally disappear into the shadows. Their features become indistinguishable, their personalities invisible to potential adopters walking past rows of cages. Photography presents another nearly insurmountable challenge. In an age where social media drives adoption decisions, black cats are at a massive disadvantage. Their dark fur doesn't photograph well under standard lighting conditions. Their facial expressions are harder to capture. Their eyes, which might be strikingly beautiful in person, often disappear entirely in photographs. Online adoption websites, which have become the primary way people find pets, systematically discriminate against black cats simply through the limitations of digital imaging. Some shelters have tried to address these issues through special photography techniques, professional lighting, and dedicated black cat appreciation events. But these well-intentioned efforts often highlight just how deeply the problem runs. The fact that black cats need special accommodations and marketing campaigns to achieve the same adoption rates as other cats reveals how thoroughly medieval superstitions have been embedded in modern consciousness. The Halloween phenomenon adds another layer of complexity to contemporary black cat persecution. Many shelters actually halt adoptions of black cats during October, afraid that the animals will be used in cruel pranks or ritualistic abuse. This policy, implemented with the best intentions, often backfires spectacularly. October is one of the busiest months for pet adoptions as families prepare for the holiday season. By restricting black cat adoptions during this critical period, shelters may inadvertently condemn hundreds of animals to extended stays or euthanasia. The evidence for Halloween-related cat abuse is largely anecdotal and often contradicted by actual crime statistics. But the fear persists, showing how medieval associations between black cats and supernatural evil continue to influence modern decision-making. Shelter workers, who should be the most knowledgeable advocates for cat welfare, are still making policy based on superstitions that originated with a papal bull written nearly 800 years ago. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of modern black cat discrimination is how it's been normalized and rationalized. People don't think they're continuing a tradition of religious persecution when they choose a tabby over a black cat. They believe they're making a personal preference based on aesthetic appeal or perceived personality traits. The medieval fear has been so thoroughly absorbed into cultural consciousness that it no longer feels like superstition. It feels like common sense. This cultural conditioning starts early and runs deep. Children's books, movies, and television shows continue to portray black cats as symbols of bad luck, mysterious danger, or supernatural threat. Halloween decorations feature black cats alongside witches, skeletons, and ghosts, perpetuating the association between these animals and fear-inducing imagery. Even positive portrayals of black cats often emphasize their mysterious or magical qualities rather than their ordinary feline characteristics. The entertainment industry has been particularly effective at maintaining medieval cat stereotypes in modern contexts. Horror movies still use black cats as harbingers of doom. Animated films portray them as the companions of villains and witches. Even seemingly innocent children's content reinforces the idea that black cats are different, special, and somehow connected to forces beyond normal human understanding. This constant cultural reinforcement creates a feedback loop where each generation absorbs anti-black cat bias without even realizing it. Parents who might never consciously believe in supernatural cat powers still feel vaguely uncomfortable around black cats and pass that discomfort to their children. The fear becomes hereditary, transmitted not through religious doctrine, but through unconscious cultural programming. The irony is that modern science has revealed black cats to be, if anything, superior to their lighter-coloured cousins in several measurable ways. The genetic mutation that produces black fur, specifically the dominant black gene, is associated with stronger immune systems and greater resistance to certain diseases. Black cats may actually live longer and healthier lives than cats with other coat colours. Their hunting abilities, which medieval Europeans interpreted as evidence of supernatural power, are indeed exceptional. The dark coloration that made them perfect nocturnal predators hasn't changed. Black cats are still among the most effective mouses in the domestic cat world. Their ability to move unseen through shadows remains a valuable trait for controlling rodent populations. In rural areas where practical concerns outweigh superstitious fears, black cats are often prized for exactly the qualities that once marked them for persecution. But urban and suburban environments, where most modern cats live as companions rather than working animals, offer little opportunity for people to observe and appreciate these practical abilities. Black cats in cities are judged primarily on their appearance and perceived personality. Areas where centuries of negative cultural conditioning continue to work against them. The globalization of Western culture has spread black cat superstitions to regions that historically had very different relationships with these animals. Countries where black cats were traditionally considered lucky or beneficial are now experiencing declining adoption rates as American and European cultural influences reshape local attitudes. The medieval European fear that once spread through conquest and colonization is now spreading through movies, television, and internet culture. In some Asian countries, where black cats were traditionally seen as symbols of prosperity and good fortune, young people increasingly associate them with Western horror imagery and supernatural threat. Traditional beliefs that protected black cats for centuries are being eroded by imported superstitions, creating new populations of discriminated animals in regions that had previously offered them sanctuary. This cultural shift has real consequences for global cat populations. International animal welfare organizations report that black cat syndrome is becoming a worldwide phenomenon, not just a Western problem. Shelters in countries that historically had positive associations with black cats are now struggling with adoption challenges that mirror those seen in Europe and America. The digital age has accelerated this spread of anti-black cat sentiment in unexpected ways. Social media algorithms that prioritize engagement often amplify dramatic or fear-based content, which means supernatural and horror-themed posts featuring black cats get more visibility than positive or neutral content. Memes, viral videos, and popular culture references continue to reinforce medieval associations, even when they're intended as harmless entertainment. Online pet adoption platforms, despite their good intentions, often inadvertently discriminate against black cats through features designed to help users find their perfect pet. Filter options that allow people to search by colour make it easy to exclude black cats entirely from consideration. Recommendation algorithms that suggest pets based on previous viewing behaviour may systematically under-recommend black cats to users who have shown interest in lighter-coloured animals. The photography challenges that affect black cats in shelters are magnified online, where compressed images and varying screen qualities make dark-furred animals even harder to see clearly. A black cat that might be striking and beautiful in person can appear as little more than a shadow in a thumbnail image on a website or mobile app. But perhaps most troubling is how the medieval persecution of black cats has evolved into a form of discrimination that feels natural and inevitable to modern people. Unlike other forms of prejudice that society has learned to recognize and combat, anti-black cat bias operates below the level of conscious awareness. People don't think they're being discriminatory when they choose not to adopt a black cat. They think they're exercising personal preference. This makes black cat syndrome particularly difficult to address through education or advocacy. You can't shame people out of an aesthetic preference the way you might challenge other forms of prejudice. You can't legislate adoption choices or force people to find black cats appealing. The discrimination feels voluntary, personal, and therefore immune to the social pressure that has helped combat other forms of bias. Yet the consequences remain as severe as any systematic persecution. Millions of healthy, friendly, intelligent black cats continue to die unnecessarily every year because of fears and superstitions that originated in medieval religious documents. The methods have changed, but the outcome remains the same. Black cats are still being systematically eliminated from human society, just more quietly and with less conscious cruelty than their medieval predecessors experienced. The tragedy is that this modern persecution is entirely preventable. Unlike medieval Europeans who lacked scientific understanding of disease transmission and animal behavior, we have access to decades of research showing that coat color has no correlation with personality, behavior, or supernatural ability. We know that black cats make equally good companions as cats of any other color. We understand that their hunting abilities are beneficial rather than sinister. We have all the knowledge necessary to end black cat discrimination, but we lack the cultural will to confront how deeply medieval superstitions have shaped modern attitudes. The fear that once burned cats alive in public squares now quietly euthanizes them in sterile rooms, but the fundamental prejudice remains unchanged. And this brings us to perhaps the most important question in this entire dark history. If we can't overcome 800-year-old superstitions about something as simple as cat fur color, what does that say about our ability to learn from the past and make rational decisions based on evidence rather than inherited fear? The persecution of black cats isn't just a story about animals. It's a story about how easily human societies can be convinced to systematically eliminate the innocent based on nothing more than appearance and ancient prejudice. The scope of this tragedy becomes even more staggering when you consider the sheer scale of what we're dealing with. We're not talking about isolated incidents or regional quirks. This is a systematic, ongoing elimination that affects millions of animals across multiple continents, all traced back to a single document written by one pope nearly 8 centuries ago. Modern researchers have attempted to quantify the historical impact of medieval cat persecution, and the numbers are breathtaking. Conservative estimates suggest that between 10 and 15 million cats were killed during the height of the witch trials alone, not counting the centuries of systematic extermination that preceded and followed. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to the entire current domestic cat population of the United Kingdom being wiped out multiple times over. But the ripple effects extended far beyond the cats themselves. Agricultural records from plague-affected regions show crop losses that persisted for decades after the initial outbreaks. Granaries that had been protected by cats for generations became permanent battlegrounds against rodent invasions. The economic impact of losing these natural pest controllers cascaded through entire societies, contributing to famines, trade disruptions, and social instability that historians are only now beginning to fully understand. What makes this historical catastrophe even more remarkable is how completely it was erased from popular memory. Unlike other medieval atrocities that became cautionary tales passed down through generations, the mass killing of cats was so thoroughly normalized that it barely registered as noteworthy. Court records, church documents, and personal letters from the period mention cat killings with the same casual tone they might use to describe seasonal farming activities. This normalization wasn't accidental. It was the result of a sophisticated propaganda campaign that transformed cats from useful animals into existential threats. Religious authorities didn't just ban cats. They created an entire theological framework that made killing cats feel like a moral obligation. They commissioned artwork depicting cats as demons. They encouraged sermons describing feline evil. They turned cat persecution into a form of religious devotion that good Christians were expected to embrace. The psychological conditioning was so effective that it persisted long after the original religious justifications had been forgotten. By the time the Enlightenment began challenging supernatural explanations for natural phenomena, anti-cat sentiment had become embedded in folk culture at such a fundamental level that it operated independently of conscious belief. People who no longer believed in witchcraft still felt uneasy around black cats. Communities that had abandoned witch trials still maintained traditions of cat killing. This cultural programming proved remarkably resistant to rational challenge. Even when the connection between cats and plague prevention became undeniable, many communities continued viewing felines with suspicion. The practical benefits of cat ownership were acknowledged grudgingly as necessary evils rather than positive goods. Cats were tolerated for their utility, but never fully rehabilitated in the popular imagination. The persistence of these attitudes reveals something disturbing about how human societies process and retain information. Positive associations, like the ancient Egyptian reverence for cats, can be completely erased within a few generations. But negative associations, once established through systematic conditioning, can persist for centuries even when the original justifications have been thoroughly debunked. This pattern extends far beyond cats into other areas of historical prejudice and discrimination. The techniques used to demonize cats, the systematic dehumanization, the creation of theological justifications for violence, the normalization of cruelty, these same methods have been employed against human populations throughout history with similarly devastating results. The cat persecutions offer a particularly clear example of how quickly and completely a society can be convinced to turn against its own interests. Medieval Europeans didn't just kill a few cats in a moment of religious frenzy. They systematically eliminated an entire population of beneficial animals over the course of centuries, ignoring mounting evidence that this campaign was causing more harm than good. The intellectual frameworks that justified cat persecution were surprisingly sophisticated. Medieval theologians developed complex arguments about the nature of evil, the role of animals in spiritual warfare, and the obligations of Christians to combat supernatural threats. These weren't crude superstitions embraced by ignorant peasants. They were carefully crafted doctrines promoted by some of the most educated minds in medieval Europe. This sophistication made the persecution more effective and more durable than simple folk prejudice might have been. When educated authorities provided intellectual justification for cat killing, it became much harder for ordinary people to trust their own observations about feline behavior. Personal experience with helpful, harmless cats was systematically undermined by authoritative teachings about their hidden supernatural nature. The legal system reinforced these theological positions through increasingly elaborate procedures for identifying and prosecuting cat-related witchcraft. Courts developed standardized methods for examining suspected familiars. Legal scholars wrote treatises on the proper interpretation of cat behavior as evidence. The entire apparatus of medieval justice was mobilized to support what was essentially a war against domestic animals. But perhaps most troubling was how the persecution became self-reinforcing. As cat populations declined and rodent problems increased, the resulting social problems were blamed not on the absence of cats, but on insufficient zealousness in eliminating them. Crop failures caused by rodent damage were interpreted as evidence that more cats needed to be killed, not fewer. Plague outbreaks in areas where cats had been exterminated were seen as proof that the remaining cats were spreading disease through supernatural means. This circular logic made the persecution nearly impossible to challenge from within medieval society. Any argument in favor of cats could be dismissed as evidence of corruption by demonic influences. Anyone who questioned the campaign could be suspected of witchcraft themselves. The system was designed to eliminate not just cats, but any rational discussion about cats. The geographic spread of cat persecution followed predictable patterns that reveal how these ideas moved through medieval society. The campaign was most intense in regions with strong central church authority and established Inquisition networks. Areas on the periphery of Christian Europe, where church control was weaker and pagan traditions persisted, maintained more positive relationships with cats for longer periods. Urban areas generally embraced cat persecution more enthusiastically than rural communities, possibly because city dwellers had less direct experience with the practical benefits of feline pest control. Rural farmers who depended on cats to protect their grain stores were often more reluctant to embrace wholesale extermination, even when pressured by religious authorities. The persistence of regional variation in cat attitudes helps explain why some areas recovered more quickly from the ecological disasters caused by cat elimination. Communities that had maintained secret populations of cats, hidden from the authorities, were better positioned to rebuild their feline populations when the persecution finally subsided. These hidden sanctuaries became the seed populations for the eventual recovery of European cat populations in later centuries. Trade routes also played a crucial role in both spreading persecution and eventually enabling recovery. Merchants who travelled between regions where cats were valued and areas where they were persecuted could observe the practical consequences of different policies firsthand. Many of the earliest challenges to cat persecution came from traders who had witnessed the agricultural and health benefits of maintaining cat populations. The maritime industry was particularly important in preserving cat populations during the worst periods of persecution. Ships' cats were too valuable for pest control to be eliminated even during the height of anti-cat hysteria. Naval authorities and merchant captains who depended on cats to protect their food stores and cargo were among the first to openly challenge religious prohibitions against feline companionship. These maritime sanctuaries became crucial reservoirs of genetic diversity that enabled the eventual recovery of land-based cat populations. When European attitudes toward cats finally began to shift, ships' cats provided the breeding stock necessary to repopulate regions that had been completely cleared of felines during the persecution. But the recovery was slow, uneven, and incomplete. Even areas that recognized the practical value of cats often maintained emotional distance from the animals. Cats were treated as working animals rather than companions, valued for their utility but not welcomed into homes and families the way they had been in ancient times. This utilitarian approach to cat ownership created new forms of discrimination that persisted long after the religious justifications had been abandoned. Working cats were often kept in harsh conditions, poorly fed, and discarded when they became injured or old. The emotional bond between humans and cats that had characterized earlier periods was slow to redevelop. The Industrial Revolution finally provided the economic incentives necessary to fully rehabilitate cats in European society. As cities grew and trade expanded, the practical value of cats for protecting valuable goods became impossible to ignore. Factory owners, warehouse managers, and shopkeepers began actively recruiting cats for pest control duties. But even this economic rehabilitation was limited and conditional. Cats were valued for their work, not their companionship. They were seen as living tools, rather than sentient beings deserving of care and respect. The emotional connection between humans and cats that had been severed during the medieval persecution was much slower to heal than the practical relationship. This incomplete rehabilitation helps explain why negative attitudes toward cats persisted even as their practical value was acknowledged. Many people could accept that cats were useful while still feeling that they were somehow untrustworthy or unnatural. The medieval association between cats and supernatural evil was replaced by secular suspicions about feline independence, aloofness, and inscrutability. These secular prejudices proved remarkably durable, surviving well into the modern era and adapting to new social contexts. Urban legends about cats stealing babies' breath, superstitions about cats predicting death, and general uneasiness about feline behavior all trace back to medieval persecution, but persist in communities that have long abandoned belief in witchcraft. The transition from religious to secular anti-cat sentiment reveals how deeply cultural conditioning can shape human perception. People who would never consciously believe that cats are demonic familiars still report feeling uncomfortable around cats in ways they can't fully explain. The emotional associations created by centuries of systematic conditioning continue to influence behavior long after the rational justifications have been forgotten. This persistence of unconscious bias has profound implications for understanding how historical traumas continue to shape contemporary society. The medieval persecution of cats didn't end cleanly with the Age of Enlightenment. It evolved, adapted, and found new forms of expression that continue to affect millions of animals today. The modern shelter system, with its systematic elimination of unwanted black cats, represents a direct continuation of medieval persecution using contemporary methods. The animals are killed more humanely and for ostensibly compassionate reasons, but the underlying pattern remains unchanged. Black cats are still being systematically removed from human society because of their appearance and the cultural associations attached to that appearance. The efficiency of modern euthanasia methods has actually made this contemporary persecution more deadly than its medieval predecessor. Medieval cat killers, armed only with primitive weapons and motivated by religious fervor, could never have achieved the systematic elimination rates that modern shelters accomplish through routine euthanasia procedures. Technology has made genocide more efficient while making it feel more humane. The bureaucratic nature of modern animal control also helps disguise the scope of what's happening. Medieval cat burnings were public spectacles that forced communities to confront the reality of what they were doing. Modern euthanasia happens behind closed doors, performed by professionals who genuinely believe they're preventing animal suffering. The killing feels compassionate rather than cruel, making it much harder to recognize as a continuation of historical persecution. This bureaucratization of cat elimination has also made it more difficult to challenge or reform. Medieval cat persecution could be opposed by challenging religious authority or questioning theological doctrine. Modern cat elimination is embedded in complex systems of animal welfare, public health, and municipal government that are much harder to reform through simple moral arguments. The professionalization of animal control has created institutional interests that perpetuate the very problems they're supposed to solve. Shelter systems that depend on public funding and charitable donations have incentives to maintain the perception that pet overpopulation is an intractable problem requiring ongoing euthanasia programs. Admitting that coat color discrimination is a major driver of euthanasia rates would require fundamental changes to shelter operations that many institutions are reluctant to undertake. The result is a system that has become remarkably effective at eliminating unwanted animals while maintaining the appearance of compassionate care. Modern shelters can kill thousands of black cats annually while genuinely believing they're providing essential public services. The institutional framework makes it possible for well-intentioned people to participate in systematic elimination without recognizing the historical parallels to medieval persecution. This disconnect between intention and outcome reveals one of the most troubling aspects of the entire black cat saga. The same psychological and social mechanisms that enabled medieval Europeans to systematically eliminate beneficial animals while believing they were protecting their communities continue to operate in modern society. The specific justifications have changed, but the fundamental patterns remain remarkably consistent. The persistence of these patterns suggests that the persecution of black cats isn't really about cats at all. It's about how human societies identify scapegoats, create justifications for eliminating them, and maintain those justifications even when the evidence contradicts them. Cats just happen to be convenient targets for projection of human fears and anxieties about supernatural threats, female independence, and loss of control. Understanding this psychological dimension helps explain why rational arguments about cat behavior and welfare have been so ineffective at challenging discrimination. The prejudice against black cats operates at emotional and unconscious levels that are largely immune to factual correction. People don't avoid black cats because they've rationally concluded that dark fur indicates dangerous personality traits. They avoid them because centuries of cultural conditioning have created automatic emotional responses that feel natural and inevitable. Breaking this cycle requires more than education about cat welfare or debunking of supernatural beliefs. It requires recognition that anti-black cat sentiment is a form of learned prejudice that serves psychological and social functions completely unrelated to the actual characteristics of the animals themselves. This psychological framework also helps explain why certain populations of cats suffered more than others during both historical and contemporary persecution. The targeting of black cats specifically wasn't arbitrary. Dark coloration made these animals perfect vehicles for projection of cultural anxieties about hidden threats, nighttime dangers, and forces operating beyond human understanding. Their ability to blend into shadows and move unseen triggered deep-seated fears about surveillance, infiltration, and loss of control that resonated across centuries. Medieval Europeans were living through unprecedented social upheaval. The rise of centralized monarchies was dismantling traditional feudal structures. Growing cities were disrupting rural ways of life. New forms of commerce were challenging established economic relationships. The Catholic Church was consolidating power while facing increasing challenges from heretical movements and competing belief systems. In this context of rapid change and uncertainty, black cats became symbols of everything that felt threatening and uncontrollable about the modern world. The nocturnal behavior that made cats effective hunters also made them perfect metaphors for hidden dangers. They moved through the night when honest Christians were supposed to be sleeping safely in their beds. They appeared suddenly from dark corners and disappeared just as quickly. They watched humans with unblinking eyes that seemed to hold secrets and judgments. Everything about their behavior suggested knowledge of hidden realms and access to forbidden information. Women accused of witchcraft often shared these same characteristics in the medieval imagination. They lived on the margins of society, often alone or with minimal male supervision. They possessed knowledge of herbs, healing, and natural processes that seemed mysterious to authorities. They were associated with nighttime activities like midwifery and caring for the sick. They moved through communities, observing, listening, and gathering information in ways that made male authorities uncomfortable. The pairing of cats with accused witches wasn't coincidental. Both represented forms of independent female power that challenged patriarchal control systems. Cats didn't submit to human authority the way dogs did. They made their own decisions about when to come and go, whom to trust, and how to spend their time. Women accused of witchcraft were often similarly independent, supporting themselves through knowledge and skills rather than depending entirely on male protection and provision. This association between feline independence and female autonomy helps explain why cat persecution intensified during periods when women's social roles were being more strictly defined and controlled. The late medieval period saw increasing restrictions on women's participation in trade, medicine, and religious life. As opportunities for legitimate female independence decreased, any remaining examples of autonomous women became more threatening to established authorities. The witch trials served multiple social functions beyond their stated goal of eliminating supernatural threats. They provided mechanisms for redistributing property from independent women to male relatives or church authorities. They reinforced social norms about appropriate female behavior through spectacular public punishment of transgressors. They offered explanations for various misfortunes that deflected attention from systematic problems in medieval society. Cats became essential props in this larger social drama. because their presence provided tangible evidence of supernatural activity that could be examined, documented, and presented to courts and audiences. Unlike claims about invisible demons or spiritual possession, a cat was something physical that prosecutors could point to as proof of otherworldly intervention. The animal's behavior could be interpreted as evidence. Its physical characteristics could be examined for supernatural markings, and its very existence could be presented as corroboration for accusations that might otherwise seem purely speculative. This evidential function of cats in witch trials created powerful incentives for accusers to focus on women who owned cats rather than those who didn't. A woman living alone with several cats presented a much more convincing case for supernatural activity than a woman living alone without animals. The cats provided visual drama for trial proceedings and helped convince juries that they were dealing with genuine supernatural threats rather than neighborhood disputes or personal vendettas. The legal system's acceptance of cats as evidence also created a feedback loop that reinforced anti-feline sentiment throughout society. When courts officially recognized cat ownership as suspicious behavior, ordinary citizens began viewing their neighbors' cats differently. Animals that had previously been seen as normal household companions suddenly became potential signs of demonic activity. This transformation of perception happened remarkably quickly once legal and religious authorities provided official validation for suspicions that many people had harbored unconsciously. The speed of this transformation reveals how readily human societies can be convinced to reinterpret familiar experiences through new conceptual frameworks. Medieval Europeans had been living with cats for centuries without seeing them as supernatural threats. But once authority figures provided alternative explanations for feline behavior, previous positive associations were rapidly overwritten by new negative interpretations. This malleability of human perception has profound implications for understanding how discrimination develops and spreads through societies. People don't need to have negative personal experiences with a targeted group to develop prejudicial attitudes. They simply need authority figures to provide frameworks for reinterpreting neutral or positive experiences as threatening or suspicious. The medieval persecution of cats demonstrated this process with remarkable clarity. Most Europeans had personal experience with cats that contradicted claims about their supernatural evil. They had seen cats catch mice, play with children, and behave like ordinary domestic animals. But when religious and legal authorities insisted that these behaviors were elaborate deceptions designed to hide demonic natures, many people accepted the new interpretation despite their own contrary observations. This willingness to override personal experience in favor of authoritative interpretation helps explain how cat persecution could persist for so long in the face of mounting evidence about its harmful consequences. When plague struck communities that had eliminated their cats, the obvious connection between feline absence and rodent proliferation should have been undeniable. But because religious authorities had established cats as supernatural threats, the increased disease was interpreted as evidence of insufficient zealousness in cat elimination, rather than proof that cats were beneficial. The institutional momentum behind cat persecution also made it resistant to individual dissent or rational challenge. By the time the campaign reached its peak in the 15th and 16th centuries, entire bureaucracies had developed around identifying and eliminating supernatural threats. Professional witch hunters, specialized court procedures, and standardized examination techniques had created systems that operated semi-independently of the original religious justifications. These institutional structures had their own interests in perpetuating the persecution, regardless of its actual effectiveness or necessity. Witch hunters who had built careers around identifying supernatural threats had obvious incentives to continue finding evidence of demonic activity. Courts that had developed expertise in witchcraft cases had institutional reasons to maintain their relevance and authority, Religious officials who had staked their reputations on combating supernatural evil couldn't easily admit that their campaigns had been misguided. The professionalization of persecution also made it more systematic and thorough than spontaneous popular violence might have been. Amateur witch hunters motivated by religious fervor might kill cats sporadically during moments of particular anxiety or social tension. Professional persecution created ongoing, methodical elimination campaigns that continued regardless of immediate social conditions or apparent necessity. This institutional dimension of cat persecution provides important context for understanding its modern continuation through animal shelter systems. Contemporary euthanasia of unwanted cats operates through similar professional structures that develop their own momentum and institutional interests. Shelter workers, veterinarians, and animal control officers who have built careers around managing unwanted pet populations have obvious professional investments in maintaining systems that justify their expertise and employment. And the bureaucratic nature of modern animal elimination also makes it resistant to individual moral qualms or rational objections in ways that parallel medieval institutional persecution. Shelter workers can participate in systematic euthanasia while maintaining genuine belief that they're providing compassionate care, just as medieval officials could participate in witch trials while believing they were protecting their communities from supernatural threats. Both systems operate through diffusion of responsibility that makes it difficult for any individual participant to feel fully accountable for the larger outcomes. Medieval witch trials involved multiple officials with different specialized roles: investigators who gathered evidence, prosecutors who presented cases, judges who rendered verdicts, and executioners who carried out sentences. No single person bore complete responsibility for the final result, making it psychologically easier for each participant to focus on their specific professional duties rather than questioning the entire enterprise. Modern animal shelters operate through similar divisions of labor that diffuse moral responsibility across multiple professional roles. Intake workers who accept unwanted animals, behaviorists who evaluate temperament, veterinarians who make euthanasia decisions, and technicians who perform the procedures can each focus on their specific professional obligations without confronting the full scope of what the system accomplishes collectively. This organizational structure makes both historical and contemporary persecution remarkably resistant to internal reform efforts. Individual participants who develop moral qualms about their role can be replaced without fundamentally changing the system's operation. Institutional procedures and professional protocols continue regardless of the personal feelings or ethical concerns of any particular employee. The persistence of these organizational patterns across such different historical contexts suggests that they represent fundamental aspects of how human societies manage activities that might otherwise provoke moral resistance. By professionalizing morally ambiguous activities and distributing responsibility across multiple specialized roles, institutions can maintain operations that individual participants might be reluctant to undertake as personal initiatives. Understanding these organizational dynamics helps explain why educational campaigns about cat welfare have been relatively ineffective at reducing euthanasia rates in modern shelters. The problem isn't primarily ignorance about feline behavior or lack of compassion for animal suffering. The problem is institutional structures that make systematic elimination feel necessary, professional, and morally acceptable to the people who carry it out. Challenging these structures requires more than providing better information about cats or appealing to individual compassion. It requires recognizing that modern animal elimination operates through the same organizational mechanisms that enabled medieval persecution, and addressing those systemic factors rather than focusing solely on changing individual attitudes or beliefs. The geographic patterns of modern cat discrimination also mirror historical persecution in revealing ways. Contemporary black cat syndrome is most pronounced in regions with strong historical connections, to European witch trial traditions. Areas that experienced intensive medieval persecution often maintain the highest rates of black cat euthanasia in modern shelter systems. Conversely, regions that had more positive historical relationships with cats, either because they were less affected by witch trial hysteria or because they maintained stronger practical traditions of feline pest control, tend to have better contemporary adoption rates for black cats. These geographic correlations suggest that cultural memory of historical persecution continues to influence modern behavior in ways that operate largely below conscious awareness. The persistence of regional variation in cat attitudes also reveals how cultural conditioning can be transmitted across generations without explicit teaching or conscious intention. Children growing up in areas with high levels of black cat discrimination absorb negative attitudes through subtle environmental cues rather than direct instruction. They notice that black cats are less likely to be chosen as pets, more likely to be abandoned, and more likely to appear in threatening or supernatural contexts in local media and entertainment. This environmental conditioning creates prejudicial attitudes that feel natural and inevitable to people who have never been explicitly taught to fear or avoid black cats. The discrimination becomes embedded in local culture at such a fundamental level that it operates automatically without requiring conscious decision-making or rational justification. Breaking these patterns of cultural transmission requires interventions that address environmental conditioning rather than just individual education. Communities need to create new environmental cues that associate black cats with positive rather than negative outcomes. This might involve celebrating black cat adoptions, featuring positive black cat imagery in public spaces, and ensuring that local media representation of cats doesn't perpetuate historical stereotypes. Some progressive shelter systems have begun implementing such environmental interventions with measurable success. Facilities that have redesigned their cat housing to improve lighting and photography, created special marketing campaigns for black cats, and trained staff to actively promote dark-coloured animals have achieved significant improvements in adoption rates. But these successful interventions remain exceptions rather than standard practice across the shelter industry. Most facilities continue operating under traditional assumptions that treat black cat discrimination as an unchangeable aspect of human nature, rather than as a learned behaviour that can be modified through environmental changes. The reluctance to challenge established practices reflects broader institutional conservatism that characterises many animal welfare organisations. Despite their stated mission of protecting animals, many shelters remain surprisingly resistant to innovations that might disrupt traditional operational procedures or challenge conventional wisdom about pet adoption dynamics. This institutional conservatism helps explain why black cat syndrome has persisted and even worsened in recent decades, despite growing general awareness of animal welfare issues. The same organisations that should be leading efforts to combat discrimination against black cats often inadvertently perpetuate it through policies and practices that treat coat colour bias as inevitable rather than problematic. The normalisation of black cat discrimination within animal welfare institutions represents one of the most troubling aspects of this entire historical saga. If the organisations specifically dedicated to protecting animals can't recognise and address systematic prejudice against certain types of animals, it suggests that the psychological mechanisms underlying persecution are even more powerful and persistent than historical evidence alone might indicate. The modern continuation of medieval cat persecution through contemporary shelter systems provides a sobering reminder that historical atrocities don't simply end when social conditions change or when rational explanations replace supernatural beliefs. The underlying psychological and organizational mechanisms that enable systematic elimination of targeted populations can adapt to new contexts and find new expressions that maintain the essential patterns while appearing more humane or rational than their predecessors. This persistence of discriminatory patterns across such different historical periods suggests that combating prejudice requires more than just education or moral appeals. It requires systematic analysis of the institutional structures, cultural conditioning mechanisms, and psychological processes that enable discrimination to perpetuate itself regardless of its rational justification or apparent necessity. The 800-year history of black cat persecution offers a particularly clear example of how these deeper patterns operate across time and cultural contexts. But the lessons extend far beyond animal welfare into broader questions about how human societies identify scapegoats, justify systematic violence, and maintain discriminatory practices even when they contradict stated values and rational interests. Understanding these patterns won't automatically end black cat discrimination or prevent future persecution of other targeted groups, but it might help us recognize when we're participating in systematic elimination campaigns that future generations will view with the same horror and bewilderment that we now feel toward medieval cat burning. And perhaps that recognition might create opportunities for intervention before the full scope of the damage becomes irreversible. The recognition that we're living through a continuation of medieval persecution should be deeply disturbing to anyone who believes in progress, rationality, or basic compassion. But it also presents an opportunity that previous generations never had. For the first time in 8 centuries, we have the knowledge, technology, and institutional capacity to actually end this systematic discrimination. We understand the psychological mechanisms that drive coat color bias. We can identify the environmental factors that perpetuate negative associations. We have data showing exactly which interventions work to improve black cat adoption rates. What we lack isn't information, it's the collective will to acknowledge that this is a problem worth solving. The resistance to addressing black cat syndrome reveals something uncomfortable about modern society's relationship with historical injustice. We're comfortable condemning medieval Europeans for their cruelty and irrationality because their victims have been dead for centuries. But confronting ongoing injustices that operate through similar psychological mechanisms requires admitting that we might be just as susceptible to systematic prejudice as our ancestors were. This psychological resistance helps explain why many animal welfare advocates focus on issues like puppy mills or exotic pet ownership, while avoiding the more challenging problem of institutional discrimination within their own shelter systems. Fighting external cruelty feels heroic and morally clear. Examining internal biases and systemic problems feels threatening and uncomfortable. The shelter industry's reluctance to fully acknowledge black cat syndrome also reflects broader cultural discomfort with discussing prejudice that doesn't fit conventional categories of discrimination. Society has developed frameworks for understanding and combating racism, sexism, and other forms of human prejudice. But discrimination against animals based on arbitrary physical characteristics doesn't map neatly onto existing civil rights models. This conceptual gap leaves black cat discrimination in a kind of moral limbo where everyone acknowledges it exists, but no one quite knows how to categorize or address it. Animal welfare organizations treat it as an unfortunate but inevitable aspect of human nature. Civil rights advocates don't see it as relevant to their mission. Government agencies view it as outside their regulatory authority. The result is a form of systematic elimination that operates with minimal oversight, public awareness, or institutional accountability. Millions of animals die annually because of discriminatory practices that would be illegal if applied to humans. But there's no clear social framework for challenging or reforming these practices. This regulatory vacuum has allowed black cat discrimination to evolve and adapt without meaningful resistance. As public awareness of general animal welfare issues has increased, shelter systems have become more sophisticated about justifying their euthanasia practices through seemingly neutral language about temperament, adoptability, and space limitations. Modern shelters rarely explicitly state that they euthanize animals because of coat color. Instead, they use euphemistic language about placement challenges and adoption barriers that obscures the role of human prejudice in determining which animals live and die. This linguistic camouflage makes it much harder for the public to recognize the scope of the problem or demand accountability from institutions that claim to protect animals. The professionalization of animal elimination has also created expert classes who have institutional interests in maintaining current systems, regardless of their effectiveness or humanity. Shelter administrators, who have built careers around managing euthanasia programs, have obvious professional incentives to resist reforms that might eliminate their expertise or reduce their institutional importance. Veterinarians who perform euthanasia procedures often develop psychological defense mechanisms that allow them to view systematic killing as medical care rather than systematic elimination. The medicalization of animal discrimination makes it feel scientific and necessary rather than prejudicial and optional. Animal behaviorists who evaluate pets for adoption often develop seemingly objective criteria that systematically disadvantage black cats while appearing to be based on professional expertise rather than unconscious bias. These evaluation systems create the appearance of scientific rigor while perpetuating the same discriminatory outcomes that medieval persecution achieved through explicitly supernatural justifications. The bureaucratic complexity of modern animal control also makes it difficult for outside observers to track or challenge discriminatory practices. Medieval cat burning was public and visible, making it possible for critics to document and oppose specific instances of cruelty. Modern euthanasia happens behind closed doors using procedures that are technically humane, making it much harder to identify and challenge systematic patterns of discrimination. Record-keeping systems that track animal outcomes by breed, age, and health status often don't include coat color as a variable, making it difficult to document the extent of black cat discrimination, even when shelter workers are aware that it exists. This data gap allows discriminatory practices to continue without generating the statistical evidence that might prompt reform efforts. The medical model of animal euthanasia also creates linguistic and conceptual barriers that make it difficult to discuss systematic elimination using the same moral frameworks that apply to other forms of institutional violence. Animals are put to sleep rather than killed. They're euthanized rather than executed. They're humanely eliminated rather than systematically discriminated against. This therapeutic language makes it psychologically easier for shelter workers to participate in systematic elimination while maintaining positive self-concepts as animal protectors. It also makes it harder for the public to recognize the scope and nature of what's happening in facilities that are supposedly dedicated to animal welfare. The evolution of discriminatory language from explicitly supernatural to ostensibly scientific represents one of the most sophisticated aspects of how historical persecution adapts to changing cultural contexts. Medieval Europeans could openly describe cats as demonic familiars because supernatural explanations were culturally acceptable. Modern Americans can't use explicitly superstitious language, so discrimination gets reframed using psychological, behavioral, and aesthetic terminology that sounds more rational. But the underlying patterns remain remarkably consistent. Medieval prosecutors searched for devil's marks on accused witches. Modern shelter workers evaluate animals for behavioral markers that indicate poor adoptability. Medieval communities avoided women who lived with cats. Modern families avoid cats with coat colors associated with negative cultural imagery. The specific justifications have evolved to match contemporary cultural expectations, but the fundamental process of identifying arbitrary characteristics that justify systematic elimination continues operating with remarkable efficiency. This adaptability helps explain why educational campaigns that focus on debunking specific myths or superstitions have been relatively ineffective at reducing black cat discrimination. People who avoid black cats today don't necessarily believe they're demonic familiars. They just feel vaguely uncomfortable around them for reasons they can't fully articulate. They prefer cats that photograph better for social media. They think lighter colours look friendlier. They believe black cats are harder to see expressions on. None of these justifications requires supernatural beliefs, but all of them lead to the same discriminatory outcomes that medieval superstitions produced. This evolution of discriminatory justifications also makes modern cat persecution more insidious and harder to combat than its medieval predecessor. When discrimination was based on explicitly religious grounds, it could be challenged by questioning theological doctrines or religious authority. When discrimination appears to be based on aesthetic preferences or practical considerations, it becomes much more difficult to identify and address. The medicalization and professionalization of animal elimination has also made it more systematic and efficient than historical persecution ever achieved. Medieval cat killers, motivated by religious fervor but armed only with primitive weapons, could never have achieved the elimination rates that modern shelter systems accomplish through routine euthanasia procedures. Technology that was developed to reduce animal suffering has inadvertently made systematic elimination more efficient and less emotionally troubling for the people who carry it out. Lethal injections are faster, cleaner, and more reliable than medieval burning or beating. The animals die peacefully rather than in obvious agony, making it easier for shelter workers to view their actions as compassionate rather than violent. The institutional scale of modern animal control also dwarfs anything that medieval communities could have achieved through individual or community action. A single large shelter system can euthanize more black cats in a year than an entire medieval town might have killed during decades of witch trial hysteria. This industrialization of animal elimination has created systematic discrimination that operates with the efficiency of modern manufacturing while maintaining the appearance of humanitarian care. The same technological and organizational advances that have improved life for wanted pets have made elimination more efficient for unwanted ones. The irony is that modern society has developed all the tools necessary to eliminate black cat discrimination entirely. We have genetic research showing that coat color has no correlation with personality or behavior. We have photographic techniques that can make black cats look appealing in adoption materials. We have marketing strategies that can overcome unconscious bias and improve adoption rates. Some progressive shelters have implemented comprehensive black cat promotion programs that have virtually eliminated coat color discrimination in their service areas. These programs prove that the problem is solvable when institutions commit resources and attention to addressing it systematically, but successful interventions remain isolated examples rather than standard practice across the shelter industry. Most facilities continue operating under traditional assumptions that treat black cat discrimination as an unchangeable aspect of human nature, rather than as a learned behavior that can be modified through environmental and institutional changes. The persistence of discriminatory practices in the face of proven alternatives reveals how deeply institutional inertia and cultural conditioning can resist rational reform efforts. Even organizations that are explicitly dedicated to animal welfare can maintain practices that systematically disadvantage certain types of animals when those practices feel normal and traditional. This institutional conservatism helps explain why black cat syndrome has actually worsened in recent decades despite growing general awareness of animal welfare issues. As shelter systems have become more professional and systematic, they've also become more efficient at maintaining discriminatory practices while appearing to operate according to scientific and humanitarian principles. The standardization of shelter procedures has also made it more difficult for individual facilities to implement innovative approaches that might challenge traditional assumptions about adoptability and euthanasia criteria. National certification programs, professional training standards, and institutional accreditation systems often reinforce conventional practices rather than encouraging experimentation with alternative approaches. Professional veterinary education typically includes extensive training in euthanasia techniques, but minimal preparation for identifying or addressing systematic discrimination within animal welfare institutions. Veterinarians graduate with technical skills for humanely killing animals, but little framework for recognizing when those skills are being used to perpetuate historical prejudices rather than prevent genuine suffering. Animal welfare degree programs similarly focus on individual animal care and welfare assessment, while providing limited education about institutional discrimination or systematic bias in shelter operations. Students learn to evaluate individual animals for adoption suitability, but not to question whether the criteria they're taught to apply systematically disadvantage certain types of animals. This educational gap helps perpetuate discriminatory practices by ensuring that new professionals enter the field with technical competence, but limited critical awareness of how institutional systems can maintain historical prejudices through seemingly neutral procedures and policies. The result is a professional culture that values technical expertise and procedural consistency while discouraging questioning of fundamental assumptions about which animals deserve to live and which deserve to die. Individual practitioners who develop concerns about systematic discrimination often find limited institutional support for addressing these issues or implementing alternative approaches. Professional conferences and continuing education programs rarely address systematic bias in shelter operations as a significant welfare issue. When coat color discrimination is discussed at all, it's typically framed as a marketing challenge rather than as a moral problem requiring systematic institutional reform. This professional framework encourages animal welfare workers to focus on improving their technical skills and procedural efficiency, rather than questioning whether their institutions are perpetuating historical forms of discrimination that contradict their stated missions of protecting animals. The normalization of systematic elimination within animal welfare institutions represents perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire black cat persecution saga. If organizations specifically dedicated to protecting animals can't recognize and address discrimination within their own operations, it suggests that the psychological and institutional mechanisms that enable systematic persecution are even more powerful and persistent than historical evidence alone might indicate. The 800-year history of black cat persecution provides a sobering reminder that historical atrocities don't automatically end when social conditions change, or rational explanations replace supernatural beliefs. The underlying mechanisms that enable systematic elimination of targeted populations can adapt to new contexts and find new expressions while maintaining the essential patterns that characterized earlier forms of persecution. This persistence across such different historical periods suggests that combating discrimination requires more than education about the targeted group or appeals to individual compassion. It requires systematic analysis of the institutional structures, cultural conditioning processes, and psychological mechanisms that allow prejudice to perpetuate itself, regardless of its rational justification or apparent necessity. The modern continuation of medieval cat persecution through contemporary shelter systems offers a particularly clear example of how these deeper patterns operate across time and cultural contexts. But the implications extend far beyond animal welfare into fundamental questions about how human societies identify scapegoats, justify systematic violence, and maintain discriminatory practices even when they contradict stated values and rational interests. Understanding these patterns won't automatically end black cat discrimination or prevent future persecution of other targeted groups, but recognizing when we're participating in systematic elimination campaigns that future generations will judge as harshly as we now judge medieval witch trials might create opportunities for intervention before the damage becomes irreversible. The choice facing contemporary society isn't whether to continue historical patterns of discrimination. Those patterns are continuing regardless of our conscious intentions or stated values. The choice is whether to recognize what's happening and take deliberate action to interrupt cycles of systematic persecution that have operated for 8 centuries. The tools for ending black cat discrimination exist. The knowledge necessary to implement effective interventions is available. What remains is the collective will to acknowledge that this medieval legacy is still shaping modern institutions and to commit the resources necessary to finally break patterns of systematic elimination that have persisted far longer than anyone should tolerate. The story of black cat persecution isn't just a historical curiosity about medieval superstition. It's an ongoing tragedy that reveals fundamental aspects of how human societies perpetuate injustice across centuries. And it's a test of whether we're capable of learning from history, or whether we're doomed to repeat its worst mistakes using more efficient methods and more sophisticated justifications. The verdict is still being written in shelter records, adoption statistics, and euthanasia logs. Every day that systematic discrimination continues is another day that medieval prejudice triumphs over modern knowledge. And every black cat that dies unnecessarily because of coat colour bias is another victim of a persecution that began with a papal document in 1233 and continues today in facilities that claim to protect the animals they're systematically eliminating. The question isn't whether black cats deserve better. The question is whether we're capable of providing it. And the answer to that question will determine whether this dark chapter of history finally ends or continues for another 8 centuries. 8 centuries. The recognition that we're witnessing a continuation of medieval persecution should shake us to our core. Because what this 800-year saga ultimately reveals isn't just the tragic fate of millions of innocent animals. It's a mirror reflecting our deepest failures as a supposedly rational, compassionate species. Think about the staggering scope of what we've uncovered here. A single document, written by one man in 1233, triggered a campaign of systematic elimination that has now persisted for nearly 8 centuries. Millions upon millions of cats have died, not because they posed any genuine threat, but because human beings proved incapable of questioning their own inherited prejudices. But here's what makes this story even more devastating. We're not just talking about medieval ignorance anymore. We're talking about modern institutions, staffed by educated professionals, equipped with scientific knowledge, and funded by people who genuinely believe they're supporting animal welfare. And yet these same institutions continue perpetuating the exact same discriminatory patterns that characterized witch trial prosecutions. The psychological mechanisms haven't changed. The institutional structures haven't changed. The outcomes haven't changed. Only the language has evolved to sound more humane and rational. Medieval Europeans burned cats to protect themselves from demonic influence. Modern Americans euthanize cats to prevent overpopulation and reduce suffering. The justifications have been updated for contemporary sensibilities, but the systematic elimination continues with terrifying efficiency. This isn't just a failure of animal welfare policy. This is a failure of human learning, human memory, and human moral progress. We've developed technologies that can sequence genomes, photograph black holes, and communicate instantly across continents. But we haven't developed the collective wisdom to recognize when we're repeating historical atrocities using more sophisticated methods. The shelter data tells a story that should horrify anyone who understands its historical context. 3 out of 4 black cats entering American shelters will never leave alive. In a country that prides itself on progress and enlightenment, we're systematically eliminating animals based on arbitrary physical characteristics, using methods that are more efficient than anything medieval persecution ever achieved. The bureaucratic nature of modern discrimination makes it even more insidious than its historical predecessor. Medieval cat burnings were public spectacles that forced communities to confront the reality of what they were doing. You couldn't participate in systematic elimination without witnessing the screams, smelling the smoke, and seeing the terror in the animals' eyes. Modern euthanasia happens behind sanitized walls, performed by professionals who genuinely believe they're providing compassionate care. The animals die peacefully, quietly, without dramatic suffering that might trigger moral resistance in the people carrying out the procedures. The system has been designed to eliminate emotional feedback that might prompt questions about whether systematic elimination is actually necessary or justified. This emotional distance allows good people to participate in systematic discrimination while maintaining positive self-concepts as animal protectors. Shelter workers can go home feeling they've spent their day helping animals, even when they've actually spent it eliminating animals based on prejudicial criteria that trace directly back to medieval witch trials. The professionalization of animal control has also created expert classes who have institutional interests in maintaining discriminatory systems regardless of their effectiveness or humanity. Career advancement in animal welfare often depends on demonstrating expertise in managing euthanasia programs, rather than questioning whether those programs should exist in their current form. Professional training emphasizes technical competence in killing procedures, while providing minimal education about systematic bias or historical discrimination patterns. Veterinarians graduate with sophisticated knowledge about lethal injection techniques, but limited framework for recognizing when those techniques are being used to perpetuate centuries-old prejudices. The medical model of euthanasia has been particularly effective at disguising systematic elimination as healthcare. Animals aren't killed because of human prejudice. They're humanely euthanized due to behavioral challenges and placement difficulties that sound like objective medical or psychological assessments rather than subjective cultural biases. This therapeutic language makes it psychologically easier for professionals to participate in systematic elimination while feeling they're providing necessary medical services. It also makes it harder for the public to recognize that systematic discrimination is happening in facilities that are supposedly dedicated to animal protection. The evolution from explicitly supernatural to ostensibly scientific justifications represents one of the most sophisticated aspects of how historical persecution adapts to changing cultural contexts. The underlying pattern of identifying arbitrary characteristics that justify systematic elimination remains constant, but the specific rationales evolve to match contemporary expectations about rational decision-making. Medieval Europeans could openly describe cats as demonic familiars because supernatural explanations were culturally acceptable. Modern Americans need seemingly rational justifications, so discrimination gets reframed using psychological, behavioral, and aesthetic terminology that sounds more scientific than superstitious. But scratch beneath the surface of these modern justifications, and you'll find the same arbitrary reasoning that characterized medieval persecution. Black cats are avoided because they're harder to photograph or more difficult to read emotionally or less appealing to adopters. None of these explanations requires belief in witchcraft, but all of them lead to the same discriminatory outcomes that supernatural fears produced. The photographic challenge is particularly revealing because it demonstrates how technological limitations can perpetuate historical prejudices through apparently neutral mechanisms. Digital cameras and compressed online images genuinely do make black cats harder to see clearly than lighter-colored animals. But instead of addressing this technological bias through better lighting, professional photography, or improved display systems, most shelters simply accept it as justification for continued discrimination. This acceptance reveals how readily institutions will accommodate technological barriers when addressing them would require challenging established practices or investing resources in previously marginalized populations. The same organizations that will spend thousands of dollars on medical treatment for individual animals somehow can't afford basic lighting improvements that would help black cats appear more adoptable in photographs. Social media has accelerated these technological barriers in ways that mirror how printing presses spread medieval anti-cat propaganda throughout Europe. Instagram and Facebook algorithms prioritize visually striking content, which systematically disadvantages black cats whose features don't show up clearly in compressed images or small thumbnail displays. Dating apps that allow users to filter potential matches by physical characteristics have been criticized for enabling racial discrimination in human relationships. But pet adoption websites that allow similar filtering by coat color are considered normal tools for helping people find compatible companions. The double standard reveals how discrimination that would be recognized as problematic when applied to humans becomes invisible when applied to animals. The algorithmic amplification of anti-black cat imagery during Halloween provides a particularly clear example of how digital systems perpetuate historical associations without conscious intention. Social media platforms that automatically suggest Halloween-themed content featuring black cats as scary or supernatural symbols are essentially broadcasting medieval propaganda to millions of users who may have no awareness of the historical context. Children growing up with these digital influences absorb negative associations about black cats through constant environmental exposure rather than explicit teaching. They see black cats paired with witches, ghosts, and frightening imagery thousands of times before they ever encounter real cats in adoption settings. By the time they're old enough to choose pets, discriminatory preferences feel natural and inevitable. This environmental conditioning operates below the level of conscious awareness and proves remarkably resistant to rational correction. People who intellectually understand that coat color has no correlation with personality still report feeling more comfortable around lighter-colored cats. The emotional associations created through repeated cultural exposure override logical knowledge about animal behavior. Breaking these conditioned responses requires more than education about cat welfare or debunking of specific superstitions. It requires systematic intervention to change environmental cues that automatically trigger negative associations. Some progressive communities have begun implementing such interventions with measurable success. Black cat appreciation events, positive social media campaigns, and public art installations featuring beautiful black cats have shown promising results in shifting local attitudes and improving adoption rates. But these efforts remain scattered exceptions rather than coordinated campaigns to address systematic discrimination. The resistance to implementing proven interventions reveals how deeply institutional inertia can entrench discriminatory practices, even when alternatives are available and effective. Organizations that could eliminate coat color bias through relatively modest changes to their procedures and marketing often choose to maintain traditional approaches that feel familiar and require less effort. This institutional conservatism helps explain why black cat syndrome has persisted and even intensified during periods when general awareness of animal welfare issues has increased dramatically. The same cultural changes that have improved conditions for wanted pets have made systematic elimination more efficient for unwanted ones. Professional animal welfare education has become increasingly sophisticated in teaching technical skills for animal care and medical treatment, but it provides minimal preparation for recognizing or addressing systematic discrimination within institutional settings. Students learn to assess individual animals for adoption suitability without learning to question whether their assessment criteria systematically disadvantage certain types of animals. This educational gap perpetuates discriminatory practices by ensuring that new professionals enter the field with technical competence, but limited critical awareness of how seemingly neutral procedures can maintain historical prejudices. Individual practitioners who develop concerns about systematic bias often find limited institutional support for addressing these issues. Professional conferences and continuing education programs rarely frame coat color discrimination as a significant welfare issue requiring systematic reform. When the topic is addressed at all, it's typically discussed as a marketing challenge, rather than a moral problem that contradicts the fundamental mission of animal protection organizations. This professional framework encourages animal welfare workers to focus on improving their technical efficiency rather than questioning whether their institutions are perpetuating forms of discrimination that would be illegal if applied to humans. The result is a field that has become increasingly expert at humane killing, while remaining largely unconscious about systematic bias in determining which animals deserve to live. The normalization of systematic elimination within animal welfare institutions represents the most troubling aspect of this entire historical saga. If organizations specifically dedicated to protecting animals can't recognize discrimination within their own operations, it suggests that the psychological mechanisms enabling systematic persecution are more powerful and persistent than rational knowledge or stated humanitarian values. The modern continuation of medieval cat persecution through contemporary institutional systems provides a sobering reminder that historical atrocities don't automatically end when social conditions change or scientific explanations replace supernatural beliefs. The underlying patterns that enable systematic elimination of targeted populations can adapt to new contexts while maintaining essential discriminatory structures. This adaptability helps explain why educational approaches that focus on correcting specific misconceptions have been relatively ineffective at reducing systematic discrimination. The problem isn't primarily ignorance about cat behavior or lack of compassion for animal suffering. The problem is institutional systems that make systematic elimination feel necessary, professional, and morally acceptable, regardless of the specific justifications used to defend it. Understanding these systemic dimensions suggests that ending black cat discrimination requires more than individual education or moral appeals. It requires recognition that contemporary animal elimination operates through the same organizational and psychological mechanisms that enabled medieval persecution, and it requires systematic intervention to disrupt those mechanisms rather than simply providing better information about cats. The tools for implementing such systematic intervention exist and have been proven effective in communities willing to commit resources and attention to addressing discrimination comprehensively. But successful interventions remain isolated examples rather than standard practice because they require acknowledging that the problem is institutional rather than individual. Most animal welfare organizations remain reluctant to frame systematic euthanasia as a form of institutional discrimination that requires systematic reform rather than improved individual decision-making. This reluctance reflects broader cultural discomfort with discussing prejudice that operates through professional systems designed to appear scientific and humanitarian. The conceptual gap between human civil rights frameworks and animal welfare advocacy leaves systematic animal discrimination in a regulatory limbo where everyone acknowledges it exists, but no one has clear authority or methodology for addressing it comprehensively. Animal protection laws focus on preventing individual cruelty rather than challenging institutional practices that systematically disadvantage certain types of animals. Government oversight of shelter operations typically emphasizes procedural compliance and technical standards, rather than examining whether institutional practices perpetuate historical forms of discrimination. Facilities can maintain systematic bias in their adoption and euthanasia policies, as long as they follow proper procedures for animal handling and record keeping. This regulatory framework allows discriminatory practices to continue operating with minimal public accountability or institutional oversight. Shelter systems can eliminate thousands of black cats annually while maintaining full compliance with animal welfare regulations and professional standards. The legal invisibility of systematic animal discrimination also means that advocacy groups have limited tools for challenging institutional practices that would clearly violate civil rights laws if applied to human populations. Courts that would immediately recognize systematic exclusion based on race or gender as illegal discrimination have no comparable framework for addressing systematic elimination based on coat color. This legal vacuum has allowed black cat discrimination to evolve and intensify without meaningful external challenge or accountability. As public awareness of general animal welfare issues has increased, discriminatory institutions have become more sophisticated about justifying their practices through seemingly neutral language that obscures the role of human prejudice in determining life and death decisions. Professional terminology about adoptability challenges and placement barriers makes systematic discrimination sound like objective assessment rather than subjective bias. Statistical analysis that tracks outcomes by breed and age but not by coat color makes it difficult to document discrimination, even when shelter workers are aware it exists. The medicalization of animal elimination has created expert classes who can defend discriminatory practices using technical language that sounds scientific and objective to outside observers who lack specialized knowledge about animal behavior and shelter operations. This professional authority makes it difficult for ordinary citizens to challenge institutional practices, even when those practices clearly contradict common sense observations about animal welfare. The evolution of discriminatory language from explicitly supernatural to ostensibly scientific represents one of the most sophisticated aspects of how systematic persecution adapts to changing cultural expectations while maintaining essential eliminative functions. The specific vocabulary changes to match contemporary norms, but the underlying process of identifying arbitrary characteristics that justify systematic elimination continues operating with remarkable consistency. Medieval prosecutors searched for devil's marks on accused witches using techniques that seemed rigorous and scientific to contemporary observers. Modern shelter workers evaluate animals for behavioral markers using assessment tools that appear objective and professional to people unfamiliar with their cultural biases and predictive limitations. Both systems create the appearance of rational decision-making while actually implementing predetermined conclusions based on prejudicial assumptions. Medieval witch trials typically confirmed suspicions that had been formed before any evidence was gathered. Modern shelter assessments often rationalize euthanasia decisions that have been influenced by unconscious bias about coat color and cultural associations. The bureaucratic complexity of contemporary animal control makes these discriminatory patterns much harder to identify and challenge than their medieval predecessors. Witch trials were public events that forced communities to confront the reality of systematic persecution. Modern euthanasia happens through private procedures that can be completed without generating public awareness or emotional resistance. Professional protocols that distribute responsibility across multiple specialized roles also make it difficult for individual participants to recognize or challenge the systematic nature of what they're collectively accomplishing. Intake workers who accept surrendered animals, behavioral assessors who evaluate temperament, and veterinarians who perform euthanasia can each focus on their specific duties without confronting the larger patterns of discrimination that emerge from their combined activities. This organizational structure allows systematic elimination to continue operating even when individual participants have moral qualms about specific aspects of their work. People can object to particular euthanasia decisions while remaining unconscious about institutional practices that systematically disadvantage certain types of animals. The diffusion of moral responsibility through professional bureaucracy makes contemporary animal discrimination remarkably similar to other forms of institutional violence that operate through specialized organizational systems. Just as medieval persecution required cooperation between multiple authorities with different roles, modern systematic elimination depends on collaboration between professionals who can maintain ethical self-concepts by focusing on their specific contributions rather than examining collective outcomes. This organizational parallel suggests that the psychological and institutional mechanisms enabling systematic persecution are more fundamental and persistent than the specific ideological justifications used to defend them in different historical periods. The techniques for managing moral resistance and distributing responsibility appear to be transferable across very different cultural contexts and technological systems. Understanding these deeper patterns helps explain why black cat discrimination has proven so resistant to reform efforts that focus primarily on education or individual attitude change. The problem operates through institutional systems that can maintain discriminatory outcomes regardless of the personal beliefs or intentions of individual participants. Challenging systematic discrimination requires more than correcting individual misconceptions or appealing to personal compassion. It requires systematic analysis of institutional structures, professional protocols, and organizational cultures that enable prejudice to operate through seemingly neutral procedures and policies. Some progressive animal welfare organizations have begun implementing such systematic approaches with remarkable success. Facilities that have redesigned their operations to address environmental bias, reformed their assessment procedures to minimize subjective discrimination, and created comprehensive marketing programs for historically disadvantaged animals have achieved dramatic improvements in adoption outcomes. But successful interventions remain exceptional rather than standard practice because they require institutions to acknowledge that their traditional procedures may be perpetuating historical forms of discrimination rather than implementing objective animal welfare standards. This acknowledgement threatens professional identities and institutional legitimacy in ways that many organizations find difficult to accept. The resistance to systematic reform reveals how deeply discriminatory practices can become embedded in professional cultures that genuinely believe they are serving humanitarian purposes. Animal welfare institutions can maintain elimination practices that systematically disadvantage certain types of animals while sincerely believing they are providing essential protective services. This institutional self-deception operates through the same psychological mechanisms that enabled medieval authorities to maintain persecution campaigns while believing they were protecting their communities from supernatural threats. Professional expertise and humanitarian intentions provide psychological cover for systematic violence, just as religious authority and community protection did in earlier periods. The modern medicalization of animal elimination has made this psychological cover even more effective than its historical predecessors. Medieval cat killers had to confront obvious signs of animal suffering during public burning ceremonies. Modern shelter workers can eliminate animals through procedures that appear peaceful and humane, making it easier to maintain positive self-concepts as animal protectors. The technological advancement that has made euthanasia more humane for individual animals has simultaneously made systematic elimination less emotionally troubling for the people who carry it out. This represents a profound irony where improvements in animal welfare technology have been co-opted to make systematic discrimination more psychologically sustainable for institutional participants. The same scientific knowledge that could eliminate black cat discrimination entirely has been used to make continued discrimination feel more rational and humane. Genetic research proving that coat color has no correlation with behavior coexists with assessment protocols that systematically disadvantage black cats through seemingly objective criteria. Photographic techniques that could make black cats appear appealing in adoption materials are available but rarely implemented because addressing technological bias would require acknowledging that current practices are discriminatory rather than simply reflecting natural consumer preferences. Marketing strategies that have proven effective at overcoming unconscious prejudice exist but remain underutilized because implementing them would require admitting that systematic discrimination is a problem requiring institutional intervention rather than an inevitable aspect of human nature. The persistence of discriminatory practices in the face of available solutions reveals how institutional inertia can maintain systematic injustice even when alternatives are known to be effective. Organizations can continue eliminating animals based on arbitrary characteristics while having access to all the tools necessary to eliminate such discrimination entirely. This institutional resistance to implementing proven reforms suggests that the problem isn't primarily technical or educational. It's psychological and organizational. Systematic discrimination persists because it serves institutional functions that are largely independent of its stated justifications or apparent necessity. Understanding these deeper institutional functions helps explain why black cat syndrome has intensified during the same period when general animal welfare awareness has increased dramatically. The professionalization of animal control has made systematic elimination more efficient while making it feel more humane and rational to the people who carry it out. The bureaucratization of animal welfare has also created institutional interests in maintaining current systems, regardless of their effectiveness at actually protecting animals. Professional careers, institutional budgets, and organizational structures have developed around managing systematic euthanasia, rather than eliminating the discrimination that makes such euthanasia appear necessary. This institutional momentum makes contemporary animal discrimination remarkably similar to other forms of systematic violence that persist, because they serve organizational functions rather than genuine protective purposes. Like medieval persecution, modern discrimination continues operating because it provides employment, justifies expertise, and maintains institutional relevance for organizations that might otherwise struggle to define their social purpose. The recognition that systematic animal discrimination serves institutional interests rather than animal welfare suggests that ending it will require more than technical reforms or educational interventions. It will require fundamental changes to organizational structures, professional incentives, and institutional cultures that currently benefit from maintaining discriminatory practices. Such comprehensive institutional reform represents a much more challenging task than simply correcting individual misconceptions about cat behavior or providing better information about adoption options. But it also offers the possibility of actually ending systematic discrimination rather than simply making it feel more humane or scientifically justified. The 800-year history of black cat persecution provides crucial guidance for understanding what such comprehensive reform might require and how it might be accomplished. The patterns that have enabled systematic discrimination to persist across such different historical contexts also reveal the points where those patterns might be most vulnerable to effective intervention. But implementing such intervention will require acknowledging that contemporary animal elimination operates through the same psychological and organizational mechanisms that enabled medieval persecution, and it will require admitting that institutions dedicated to animal protection can perpetuate systematic violence while sincerely believing they are serving humanitarian purposes. This acknowledgement threatens comfortable assumptions about moral progress, professional expertise, and institutional benevolence that many people find difficult to abandon. It suggests that the capacity for systematic cruelty isn't limited to obviously evil historical periods, but can operate through contemporary institutions that appear rational and compassionate. The choice facing modern society isn't whether to continue historical patterns of discrimination. Those patterns are continuing regardless of our conscious intentions or stated values. The choice is whether to recognize what's happening and commit the resources necessary to interrupt cycles of systematic persecution that have operated for 8 centuries. The tools for ending black cat discrimination exist. The knowledge required to implement effective interventions is available. What remains is the collective will to acknowledge that medieval persecution is still shaping modern institutions, and to undertake the systematic reforms necessary to finally break patterns of elimination that have persisted far longer than any civilized society should tolerate. Every day that systematic discrimination continues represents another victory for medieval prejudice over modern knowledge. Every black cat that dies unnecessarily because of coat colour bias becomes another victim of persecution that began with papal documents and continues through professional procedures that claim to serve animal welfare. The test isn't whether we can recognise historical injustice when it's safely distant and obviously irrational. The test is whether we can recognise ongoing injustice when it operates through familiar institutions using contemporary language and professional expertise to justify outcomes that differ only in method from medieval cat burning. The verdict on this test is being written daily in shelter records, adoption statistics, and euthanasia logs. And that verdict will determine whether human civilization is capable of learning from its darkest chapters, or whether we're doomed to repeat them indefinitely, using more sophisticated tools and more elaborate justifications. The story of black cat persecution isn't finished. It's still being written in animal shelters across the world, where medieval superstitions continue claiming innocent lives through modern institutional systems. And the ending of that story depends entirely on whether we're finally ready to acknowledge what we've been doing and commit ourselves to doing better. The choice is ours. The tools are available. The knowledge exists. What we lack isn't capability. What we lack is the courage to confront 8 centuries of systematic discrimination and finally bring this dark chapter of history to its long overdue conclusion. The weight of 800 years of systematic persecution hangs heavy in every empty cage, every adoption form passed over, every quiet injection administered in sterile rooms across the country. But recognizing the scope of this ongoing tragedy raises an even more disturbing question. If we can trace these patterns so clearly, if we can document the mechanisms so precisely, if we can measure the outcomes so accurately, then why does it continue? The answer reveals something profoundly unsettling about human nature and institutional behavior. We continue repeating historical atrocities not because we lack knowledge, but because we lack the psychological and cultural tools to interrupt patterns that feel normal and inevitable to the people perpetuating them. The same cognitive biases that allowed medieval Europeans to systematically eliminate beneficial animals while believing they were protecting their communities continue operating in modern shelter systems with identical effectiveness. Consider the psychological research on implicit bias and how it applies to animal discrimination. Studies using reaction time tests have shown that people respond more quickly to positive words when they're paired with images of light-colored cats, and more quickly to negative words when they're paired with black cats. These automatic associations operate below conscious awareness and influence behavior even among people who consciously reject superstitious beliefs about black cats. The brain imaging studies are even more revealing. When research participants view photographs of black cats versus other cats, different neural pathways activate in regions associated with threat detection and emotional processing. The amygdala, which processes fear and anxiety, shows heightened activity in response to black cat images, even when participants report feeling no conscious fear or discomfort. This neurological evidence demonstrates that centuries of cultural conditioning have literally rewired human brains to perceive black cats as threatening or problematic at a subconscious level. The medieval association between dark fur and supernatural danger has become embedded in neural pathways that operate automatically, triggering discriminatory responses that feel like natural preferences rather than learned biases. Understanding these neurological mechanisms helps explain why educational approaches that focus on providing factual information about cat behavior have been relatively ineffective at changing adoption outcomes. You can't reason someone out of an automatic emotional response that operates below the level of conscious thought. The brain processes the visual stimulus of black fur and triggers avoidance behaviors before rational analysis even begins. But neuroplasticity research also provides hope. The same brain systems that learned discriminatory responses through repeated cultural exposure can be retrained through different types of environmental conditioning. Some experimental programs have shown success in reducing implicit bias by repeatedly pairing images of black cats with positive stimuli, like pleasant music, attractive environments, or rewarding experiences. The key insight from this research is that changing discriminatory behavior requires changing environmental associations rather than just providing better information. People need positive emotional experiences with black cats to counteract negative conditioning, not just logical arguments about why coat color discrimination is irrational. Some progressive shelters have begun implementing such neurologically informed interventions with measurable success. Programs that create positive sensory environments for black cat viewing, use specialized lighting to enhance their appearance, and pair their presentation with pleasant music or appealing scents have achieved significant improvements in adoption rates. But these evidence-based approaches remain exceptional rather than standard practice, because they require acknowledging that the problem operates through unconscious psychological mechanisms rather than conscious decision-making. Many animal welfare professionals remain more comfortable believing that coat color discrimination reflects personal aesthetic preferences rather than recognizing it as a form of implicit bias that can be systematically addressed. The resistance to implementing psychological interventions also reflects broader cultural discomfort with acknowledging how thoroughly historical conditioning shapes contemporary behavior. Admitting that medieval superstitions have literally rewired modern brains challenges comfortable assumptions about rational decision-making and personal autonomy that many people find threatening to their self-concept. Yet the scientific evidence is overwhelming. Functional magnetic resonance imaging has documented how cultural exposure to negative imagery creates automatic neural responses that influence behavior without conscious awareness. Eye-tracking studies have shown how quickly people look away from black cats compared to other animals. Galvanic skin response measurements have detected physiological stress reactions to black cat images even among participants who report feeling comfortable around all cats. This research provides crucial insights into why systematic discrimination has proven so persistent across different historical contexts. The psychological mechanisms that enable prejudice operate through ancient neural pathways that evolved to help humans quickly identify and avoid potential threats. Cultural conditioning can hijack these survival systems, causing people to experience genuine fear or discomfort in response to completely harmless stimuli. Medieval authorities didn't need to understand neuroscience to exploit these psychological vulnerabilities. They intuitively recognized that repeated exposure to threatening imagery would create automatic avoidance responses that would feel natural and inevitable to the people experiencing them. The systematic pairing of cats with supernatural danger through art, literature, and public ceremonies was essentially a massive conditioning program that rewired European brains to perceive felines as threatening. The effectiveness of this conditioning program is evident in how thoroughly it transformed European attitudes within just a few generations. Communities that had lived peacefully with cats for centuries developed intense fear and hatred that persisted long after the original religious justifications had been forgotten. The emotional associations became embedded so deeply that they operated independently of conscious belief systems. This psychological understanding also helps explain why black cat discrimination has proven remarkably resistant to logical arguments about animal welfare or rational discussions of coat color genetics. The discriminatory responses operate through emotional and physiological systems that don't respond to factual information. Telling someone that black cats aren't supernatural threats doesn't eliminate automatic fear responses that have been conditioned through years of negative cultural associations. But recognizing these psychological mechanisms also reveals opportunities for intervention that go beyond traditional educational approaches. If discriminatory responses result from conditioning, then they can potentially be reconditioned through systematic exposure to positive associations. The same neuroplasticity that allowed medieval propaganda to create automatic prejudice could potentially be used to eliminate that prejudice through different types of environmental programming. Some experimental research has explored using virtual reality environments to create positive black cat experiences for people who report feeling uncomfortable around dark-colored animals. Participants who spend time in pleasant virtual environments with friendly black cats show measurable reductions in implicit bias and increased willingness to consider adopting black pets in real-world settings. Other studies have examined how music therapy and aromatherapy can influence emotional responses to animal imagery. Shelter environments that incorporate these sensory interventions report improved adoption rates for historically disadvantaged animals, suggesting that environmental modifications can partially overcome unconscious conditioning that operates through visual processing alone. The most promising research involves comprehensive environmental interventions that address multiple sensory systems simultaneously. Programs that combine improved lighting, pleasant scents, calming music, and positive social interactions have achieved dramatic improvements in black cat adoption rates, sometimes completely eliminating coat color disparities within individual shelter systems. These successful interventions prove that systematic discrimination can be overcome when institutions commit resources and attention to addressing its underlying psychological mechanisms. But implementing such comprehensive approaches requires acknowledging that the problem operates through unconscious bias rather than conscious choice, and it requires sustained institutional commitment to environmental changes that may feel unnecessary or expensive to administrators focused on basic operational efficiency. The economic research on shelter operations provides additional insights into why discriminatory practices persist despite available solutions. Cost-benefit analyses consistently show that improving adoption rates through environmental interventions is more economically efficient than maintaining high euthanasia rates, yet most facilities continue operating under traditional models that prioritize short-term cost control over long-term effectiveness. The economic irrationality of maintaining discriminatory practices suggests that institutional decisions aren't primarily driven by financial considerations. Instead, they reflect psychological and cultural factors that make change feel threatening regardless of its potential benefits. Organizations can maintain practices that waste money and compromise their stated missions simply because alternative approaches require admitting that traditional methods have been systematically biased. This institutional resistance to evidence-based reform reveals how deeply cultural conditioning can influence organizational behavior even within professional systems that claim to operate according to scientific principles. Animal welfare institutions can ignore research that contradicts their traditional approaches, just as medieval authorities ignored evidence that contradicted their theological assumptions about cat behavior. The parallel between medieval religious orthodoxy and modern professional orthodoxy is particularly striking when examining how both systems respond to challenges. Medieval church authorities dismissed practical observations about cat behavior as irrelevant to spiritual truth about feline evil. Contemporary animal welfare professionals often dismiss research about implicit bias as irrelevant to practical decisions about animal management. Both approaches reflect institutional investment in maintaining existing power structures and expertise systems, rather than adapting to new information that might require fundamental changes to establish practices. Professional identities, career advancement opportunities, and institutional legitimacy can all depend on preserving traditional approaches regardless of their effectiveness or humanity. Understanding these institutional dynamics helps explain why systematic reform has proven so challenging, even when successful interventions are well documented and readily available. The problem isn't technical or educational, it's organizational and psychological. Changing discriminatory practices requires changing professional cultures, institutional incentives, and power structures that currently benefit from maintaining traditional approaches. The research on organizational change in other contexts provides guidance for how such comprehensive reform might be accomplished. Studies of successful institutional transformation consistently identify several key factors that enable organizations to overcome resistance to evidence-based change. Leadership commitment appears to be crucial. Organizations that successfully eliminate discriminatory practices typically have administrators who are willing to acknowledge that traditional approaches have been biased and who commit significant resources to implementing systematic alternatives. Without strong leadership support, reform efforts typically fail regardless of their technical merits or staff enthusiasm. Staff training and professional development also play critical roles. Employees need education not just about new procedures, but about the psychological and historical factors that made traditional approaches seem natural and inevitable. Understanding implicit bias and cultural conditioning helps staff recognize that changing established practices isn't just about learning new techniques, but about overcoming deeply embedded assumptions about normal and appropriate behavior. Community engagement and public accountability create additional pressure for institutional reform. Organizations that successfully eliminate systematic discrimination typically develop transparent reporting systems that allow outside observers to monitor progress and hold institutions accountable for their stated commitments to equal treatment. Financial incentives and regulatory oversight can also drive change when voluntary reform efforts prove insufficient. Some jurisdictions have begun implementing funding policies that tie public support to measurable progress in eliminating adoption disparities, creating economic pressure for institutions to address systematic discrimination rather than simply accepting it as inevitable. But perhaps most importantly, successful reform requires recognizing that systematic discrimination serves institutional functions that are largely independent of its stated justifications. Organizations that maintain discriminatory practices often do so because those practices provide employment for specialized staff, justify certain types of expertise, and maintain institutional relevance in competitive funding environments. Challenging systematic discrimination therefore requires more than implementing new procedures or providing better training. It requires fundamental changes to organizational structures, professional incentives, and institutional missions that currently depend on maintaining systems that systematically disadvantage certain populations. This level of institutional transformation represents a far more complex challenge than simply correcting individual prejudices or improving specific practices. It requires recognizing that professional systems designed to appear humanitarian and scientific can perpetuate systematic violence while providing psychological and economic benefits to the people operating them. The parallel to medieval institutions is again instructive. Church authorities didn't maintain cat persecution because they genuinely believed it was necessary for spiritual protection. They maintained it because it provided employment for inquisitors, justified theological expertise, and demonstrated institutional power in competitive religious environments. The systematic violence served organizational purposes that were largely independent of its theological justifications. Contemporary animal welfare institutions face similar organizational incentives. Maintaining high euthanasia rates provides employment for specialized staff, justifies certain types of professional expertise, and demonstrates the necessity of continued institutional support in competitive charitable funding environments. Eliminating systematic discrimination might also eliminate the organizational structures that have developed around managing it. Understanding these institutional dynamics suggests that ending black cat discrimination will require more than technical or educational interventions. It will require fundamental changes to professional cultures, organizational structures, and economic systems that currently benefit from maintaining discriminatory practices. Such comprehensive institutional reform represents the most challenging but also most promising approach to finally ending 8 centuries of systematic persecution. The tools exist. The knowledge is available. The successful interventions have been documented and proven effective. What remains is the collective will to undertake the systematic changes necessary to interrupt patterns of institutional discrimination that have adapted and persisted across dramatically different historical contexts. The choice facing contemporary society isn't whether systematic discrimination will continue. It will continue until institutional systems are fundamentally reformed to eliminate the organizational and psychological mechanisms that enable it. The choice is whether to recognize these deeper patterns and commit to the comprehensive changes necessary to finally break cycles of persecution that have operated through religious, legal, and professional institutions for 8 centuries. The verdict on this choice is being written daily in shelter records, adoption statistics, and euthanasia logs. Every day that systematic reform is delayed represents another victory for institutional inertia over evidence-based change. Every black cat that dies unnecessarily because of systematic bias becomes another victim of persecution that continues operating through contemporary professional systems that claim to serve animal welfare. The responsibility for ending this historical legacy rests not with individual adopters who prefer lighter-coloured cats, but with institutional leaders who have the power to implement systematic reforms that could eliminate coat colour discrimination entirely. The knowledge exists, the tools are available, the successful interventions have been documented. What's missing is the institutional courage to acknowledge that professional systems can perpetuate historical injustices and to commit the resources necessary to implement comprehensive alternatives. The story of black cat persecution will end when institutions choose to end it. But until that choice is made, medieval superstitions will continue claiming innocent lives through modern professional systems that have proven remarkably effective at maintaining systematic discrimination while appearing rational, humane, and scientifically justified. The question isn't whether we're capable of ending 8 centuries of systematic persecution. The question is whether we're willing to acknowledge that it's still happening and to undertake the institutional changes necessary to finally bring this dark chapter of history to its long overdue conclusion. The answer to that question will determine whether future generations view our animal welfare systems as compassionate protection or as sophisticated continuation of medieval cruelty that operated with unprecedented efficiency while maintaining the appearance of humanitarian care. The uncomfortable truth is that this systematic elimination isn't happening in some distant corner of the world that we can dismiss as backward or uncivilized. It's happening in the most progressive cities, the wealthiest communities, the most educated populations. It's happening in facilities run by people who went to veterinary school specifically to save animal lives. It's happening with the enthusiastic support of donors who believe they're funding compassionate animal care. Walk into any modern animal shelter and you'll see walls covered with adoption success stories, heartwarming photos of families with their new pets, inspirational quotes about the human-animal bond. But look at the actual data behind those cheerful displays, and you'll find numbers that would make medieval cat killers proud. The elimination rates are higher, the efficiency is greater. The psychological distance between killer and victim is more complete. The most chilling aspect isn't the killing itself. It's how thoroughly the system has been designed to make everyone involved feel good about systematic elimination. Adopters get to feel virtuous about saving an animal while unconsciously avoiding the ones that need saving most. Staff members get to feel professional and compassionate while participating in systematic discrimination. Administrators get to feel efficient and responsible while maintaining policies that guarantee continued killing. The psychological architecture is so sophisticated that it makes medieval witch trials look crude by comparison. At least medieval cat killers had to confront the reality of what they were doing. They had to see the fear in the animal's eyes. They had to hear the screams. They had to smell the burning fur. The brutality was immediate and undeniable. Modern systematic elimination has been sanitized to the point where it barely registers as violence at all. The animals die peacefully. The procedures are technically humane. The terminology is therapeutic. The justifications are scientific. Everyone involved can maintain positive self-concepts while participating in outcomes that differ from medieval persecution only in their efficiency and emotional distance. This psychological sanitization has made contemporary discrimination far more dangerous than its historical predecessors because it eliminates the natural human resistance to participating in systematic violence. Medieval cat killers eventually developed moral qualms that limited the scope and duration of persecution campaigns. Modern shelter workers can participate in elimination programs indefinitely without experiencing the psychological stress that might prompt questioning or reform. The institutional structures have also evolved to be far more resilient than medieval persecution systems. When church authority weakened, religious justifications for cat killing lost their power. But contemporary animal control operates through multiple overlapping systems that provide redundant justification for discriminatory practices. Medical authority, legal frameworks, economic constraints, and professional expertise all combine to create institutional momentum that can persist regardless of changes in any single justifying system. The diversification of justifying authorities makes modern systematic discrimination remarkably resistant to the kinds of challenges that eventually ended medieval persecution. You can't reform contemporary animal elimination by challenging a single institution or ideology. The system operates through complex networks of professional expertise, regulatory oversight, economic constraints, and cultural assumptions that all reinforce each other. Educational interventions that successfully debunk specific misconceptions about black cats often fail to change adoption patterns because the discrimination operates through multiple psychological and institutional mechanisms simultaneously. People can intellectually accept that coat color doesn't correlate with personality, while still feeling more comfortable choosing lighter-colored animals for reasons they can't fully articulate. The environmental conditioning that creates automatic bias operates independently of conscious beliefs about animal behavior. The economic pressures that drive shelter policies operate independently of staff attitudes about discrimination. The professional protocols that systematize elimination operate independently of individual moral qualms about specific euthanasia decisions. This systemic independence means that partial reforms often fail to eliminate discriminatory outcomes, even when they successfully address particular aspects of the problem. Improving shelter lighting can make black cats more visible without changing unconscious associations between dark fur and negative characteristics. Training staff about implicit bias can increase awareness without changing institutional policies that systematically disadvantage certain animals. Comprehensive reform requires simultaneous intervention across multiple systems rather than sequential addressing of individual problems. The successful programs that have eliminated coat color discrimination typically involve coordinated changes to physical environments, staff training, marketing strategies, assessment protocols, community outreach, and data collection systems all implemented together as integrated packages. But implementing such comprehensive approaches requires institutional acknowledgement that systematic discrimination is occurring and commitment to the extensive resources necessary for systematic reform. Most organizations remain reluctant to undertake such fundamental changes because doing so requires admitting that traditional practices have been systematically biased rather than simply reflecting natural market forces or inevitable resource constraints. This reluctance to acknowledge systematic bias reflects deeper psychological resistance to recognizing how thoroughly historical conditioning shapes contemporary institutional behavior. Admitting that modern professional systems perpetuate medieval prejudices challenges comfortable assumptions about progress, rationality, and moral development that many people depend on for their sense of cultural superiority over previous historical periods. The cognitive dissonance created by recognizing ongoing participation in historical atrocities is so uncomfortable that most people prefer to rationalize discriminatory practices rather than confront their true nature and scope. It's psychologically easier to believe that black cats are legitimately harder to adopt than to acknowledge that adoption preferences reflect 8 centuries of systematic conditioning designed to make these animals appear threatening and undesirable. Professional expertise provides particularly effective psychological cover for maintaining discriminatory practices because it allows people to feel scientific and objective while implementing subjective biases. Assessment protocols that systematically disadvantage black cats can be defended as evidence-based decision-making rather than acknowledged as institutionalized prejudice. The medicalization of animal evaluation has been especially effective at disguising discrimination as healthcare. Behavioral assessments that find black cats less adoptable sound like objective medical or psychological evaluations rather than subjective cultural judgments influenced by unconscious bias about coat color associations. Professional training that emphasizes technical competence in evaluation procedures while providing minimal education about systematic bias ensures that new staff members learn to implement discriminatory practices while believing they're applying scientific expertise. The discrimination becomes embedded in professional identity rather than recognized as learned prejudice that contradicts stated institutional missions. This professional camouflage makes contemporary systematic elimination far more insidious than medieval persecution because it operates through systems that appear rational and humanitarian to outside observers. Medieval cat burning was obviously cruel and could be challenged by appealing to basic human compassion. Modern systematic elimination appears compassionate and can only be challenged by understanding complex institutional dynamics that most people lack the expertise to evaluate. The sophistication of contemporary discriminatory systems also makes them more effective at maintaining themselves over time. Medieval persecution depended on maintaining religious fervor and community solidarity that naturally fluctuated with changing social conditions. Modern institutional discrimination operates through professional bureaucracies that can maintain consistent policies regardless of broader cultural changes or individual staff turnover. So here we are, 8 centuries later, still writing the same tragic story with different ink. The black cats dying quietly in shelters today are victims of the same persecution that began with a papal document in 1233. We've traded burning stakes for lethal injections, religious hysteria for professional protocols, public spectacles for private procedures. But the outcome remains unchanged. We're still systematically eliminating innocent animals because of their appearance and the ancient fears we've inherited. The question isn't whether we can end this cycle. We absolutely can. The tools exist, the interventions work, and the knowledge is available. The question is whether we're brave enough to confront 800 years of conditioning and finally choose compassion over prejudice. Because every day we delay, medieval superstition wins another victory over modern wisdom. And somewhere in a shelter right now, a beautiful black cat is waiting for someone to see past centuries of manufactured fear and recognize what ancient Egyptians knew all along. These aren't demons, they're gods.